Hi, and welcome to Hate Crime. So this is session 5, and this is part 2 of session 5. And today I'm going to be talking to my good friend, former colleague, and collaborator in research, Alex Oaten. Hi, Alex.
Yeah.
So Alex is based at the University of Birmingham. He's in the politics department, politics and international relations. I'm going to give Alex a chance to talk about his research at the moment, in a moment. But one of the things you'll see that if you look online, you'll see that Alex's article, Cult of the Victim, where he looks at the collective identity of the English Defence League, is actually on the reading list. So do make sure you should have read it by now. If you haven't read it, then do make sure you have a look at it straight after, okay? Because it gives you some really great insights and gives you a lot of context for some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. So yeah, so that's good. So Alex, I wonder whether you could just start by telling our students a little bit about the research you did, and particularly kind of like that how you did it, because I think that it'll be good that to kind of get across to the students the way in which you embedded yourself within the English Defence League, this far right kind of extremist group. So yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about that, that'd be great. Cheers.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Chris. So my interest in the English Defence League started because some people who I actually went to school with and come from a predominantly working class community, some of the people I went to school with had got involved in the English Defence League, and so I started initially just going onto demonstrations, having a look, and that led to a period of 18 months of a research project, so an ethnographic study of the English Defence League. What that basically meant is I embedded myself in with a local group of English Defence League activists. So I went on demonstrations. So it was a combination of both overt and covert participant observation. Yeah. Some of the activists knew who I was. They knew I was an academic doing a research study. Other people didn't know who I was. So for all intents and purposes, when I was on the demonstrations, I was just another face in the crowd, another EDL activist. And so I spent 18 months going on demonstrations all around the country with English Defence League, also attending meetings with them and going on social events. And then I followed this up with in-depth narrative interviews. And so, again, what I was interested in when speaking to this group of activists, so I spoke to 9 different activists in a lot of detail, essentially a life history. So I want to know why they had become part of the English Defence League, what had motivated them to become part of the English Defence League, to engage with this kind of very contentious and extremist activism, and also to find out how being a member of the English Defence League had affected their identity. What did they feel when they went on English Defence League marches? What were their motivations, and how that changed their identity? How did they feel part of this collective group?
So can you give us just a kind of brief overview of what were the views of the English Defence League? Right? What did they believe? Were they white supremacists? Were they kind of lesser so? Were they a racist organisation, Islamophobic? How would you kind of how would you kind of describe them or explain them?
Okay, so the first thing that I learned very quickly, I had my own assumptions about who would be in the English Defence League. It was actually a broader base of appeal than I thought, and other ethnographers, people like Joel Busher, who's also conducting ethnography in the English Defence League, have found this as well, that actually they appeal to a broader section of the community than you would possibly usually expect with a far right, extreme right organisation. And I think this was shown really clearly in they had specialist divisions. So English Defence League had an LGBT division, they had a Jewish division, they had a Sikh division, and so in some respects, whilst it was tapping into a very strong undercurrent of what I would call cultural racism, it actually appeal to a wider section of the community. I mean, at first people thought they were, mainly football hooligans.
Yeah.
Yes, there were certainly people from football hooligan firms there, but it was actually able to appeal to a wider section of the community with these kind of special interest groups. There was an EDL Angels division as well, which was for female members. And with my narrators, I spent an awful lot of time with my narrators. I got to know them very well. They all had grievances. My kind of the way I simplify it to people when I'm talking about the English Defence League is, on the whole, happy people don't join the English Defence League. People, they all had very, very different grievances.
Yeah.
Quite a broad spectrum of grievances, both economic, but also in terms of what we call identitarian grievances. So feel that their traditional working class communities or were under threat. But also, often economic problems. So some of the narrators who I worked with and got them to tell me their story, they were often living in really deprived areas, 0-hour contracts, not necessarily even in work or long-term unemployment. And so there's quite a lot of different grievances that link up with the base membership in the Defence League. What comes out of that for me, and I'll discuss it in that article from 2014 that's on the reading list, is that individually, a lot of the members of English Defence League who I spoke to felt disempowered. They felt individually like they lacked power. And they often felt, well, a large extent, they felt victimised in certain ways, shapes or forms. What the English Defence League did was it brought together this collective identity of a shared victimhood. And when you get a group of people who all share this sense of themselves as victims and this collective victimhood, it becomes a very potent collective identity. So it could draw in people with a range of different demands and grievances against not just the government, against society as a whole. What I found is not necessarily all of the English Defence League members had initially problems with Islam or the Muslim community in communities. Often they had other grievances, but then when they became part of the English Defence League, this kind of new identity came about. So there's a wide base of different, of different reasons and grievances that initially make people join the English Defence League. But as I say, happy people don't tend to join these kind of movements. There's a grievance.
I mean, you said so. Just to pick up on a couple of things there. So you said about cultural race. You used the phrase cultural racism, and this is something that that our students have been kind of introduced to in previous weeks. So this the difference between, say, kind of colour racism or historical racism, and this kind of newer kind of like cultural racism form. I mean, did you encounter anyone within the group that was, say, racist in that old traditional way, or was it always just kind of this kind of cultural kind of Islamophobic kind of stuff?
So I think on demonstrations, you would occasionally hear and encounter individuals with what I would call the old-fashioned, the more traditional biological racism, white supremacies, is how I would talk to. Those kind of groups still do exist, but they're very, very much to a fringe in what I would say is contemporary kind of extremism. So you would get, you would occasionally get that. And certainly if you look at the EDL as a movement, there was very, on several occasions, there were infighting between people who were seen to hold these traditional biological racist views. On the whole, the English Defence League policed that itself. And, it was the English Defence League, one of its first slogans, all the way back from sort of 2009 was black and white unite. This idea of trying to appeal to different sections of the community who wouldn't necessarily become involved in this kind of far-right extremist group. And so, yes, there were certainly tensions between that sort of old-style biological racism, certainly with some people who tended to hold kind of what I call sort of the neo-Nazi Zionist conspiracy theories and things like that. But on the whole, they were isolated within the movement. Instead, the English Defence League, for me, was much more about what I would call cultural racism. Essentially, no longer the the discourse that says that white people are inherently more intelligent or better than people from other races.
Yeah.
Instead, within cultural racism, within English Defence League, and I would argue a lot of the far right extremism now, although biological racism still certainly does exist in fringes. Cultural racism now, it stresses that cultural differences, that insurmountable cultural differences, and it's often couched in language that our culture, for the English Defence League, white English culture, or certainly English working class culture, is being threatened by some kind of dangerous outsider, another culture. Now, I think you find this in your own work on Islamophobia, when I think we talked a few years ago in a podcast that we did together, where you said that you'd been speaking to people who were opposing the building of a mosque, and the reasons they were given for that opposition towards that mosque is very cultural, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, you'll know the area. So the research was done in Dudley, so for those who don't know, Dudley is an area in the West Midlands, but just on the outskirts of Birmingham. Birmingham much more cosmopolitan. Dudley, part of what's known as the Black Country, and less cosmopolitan is probably the best way to describe it in comparison. And yeah, there was some of the opposition which was shown around, particularly from the EDL, was this idea that that it would Islamify the area, that it would take over. And when I was doing research with some of the people who were opposing this, their things, they would say things like, well, the minarets of the tower, it's like a lookout post, and then they would say, well, the architecture looks like, the top of a castle, and it's the ramparts. And so they saw it more as a kind of like, a kind of building that was more, akin to something which was defending, or kind of from where warfare would take place, than what it was a place of worship, So I mean, this kind of stuff really came through, this kind of cultural otherness, like the kind of cultural racism. And that's something that, like I say, we've been talking about in previous weeks. We've been talking about kind of Islamophobia, we've been talking about cultural racism. Amy's been talking about kind of, the way in which anti-immigration nowadays is kind of feeding into that as well. And one of the, so there was a couple of things you picked up on there. And I guess that, like, I'm kind of getting you to fast forward now to like 2020, so your research was done, was it 6 years ago, something like that? And obviously the kind of the English Defence League and the kind of the kind of far right milieu in the UK has kind of transformed and changed things. And one of the things that we picked up on last week with the Home Office figures around kind of recorded hate crimes in the last year has been this response to the Black Lives Matter movement, and saying that the far right protests to those, earlier this year have kind of like, they've said that's where one of the upsurges in kind of like, hate crime figures in June and July came. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm never really convinced that, the far right is behind all hate crime. I don't, I mean, was there anything from your time, kind of there that kind of suggested that, like that those people going to the demonstrations were also the ones who were perpetrating hate crimes? Did you see anything that kind of went on outside of the demonstrations at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, the most important thing to know is that we have to see it as a sliding scale from contentious politics on the one hand, street-based activism that often links into public order and criminality. And then that's a sliding scale from that kind of contentious politics, the groups like English Defence League get involved, all the way up to the extremist sort of levels and the hate crime and issues like that. And I mean, for me, that's why I find sort of these ideas of, the lone wolf terror attacks unhelpful, because I think that the discourse around groups like the English Defence League, but now, the Football Lads Alliance and people like that, it all sets a music for people who may take more violent measures. It all sets that context in which these different people operated. And again, officially, the English Defence League was, not violent, no longer silent. There was this idea that, it's not about violence. You go on a demonstration, incredibly antagonistic. Violence does occur. I've seen violence on demonstrations. Witnessed what I would class as hate speech, or I think anybody objectively would class as hate speech as well. And so the idea that this is just street-based protest and doesn't stray into what we would term more as extremism, when people are potentially violently, opposing our fundamental values and democracy and the rule of law. There's that sliding scale. Is everybody who goes on the English Defence League march an extremist? No, they're not. However, together as a package of kind of a strategy and of actors and that discourse that groups like the English Defence League put across, I would say that they are extremists and they set the context for.
So can I
violence.
jump in there? Because that notion of what is an extremist and what isn't, that the kind of definition of extremism is something that we're going to be talking about in the other parts of this this session. So how would you make that distinction? What makes somebody an extremist, from somebody who's not? Because you said that when you went on the march, there were some who were extremists and some weren't. How would you make that distinction?
So for me, I think that in essence, when we start talking about somebody who's extreme, it is somebody who is directly opposing fundamental values of tolerance, of tolerance towards different faiths and different beliefs, often as what I would call a language of antagonism that leads directly into violence, or can lead to violence, and that kind of active opposition against our fundamental beliefs within a liberal democracy. And what's interesting with groups like the English Defence League, and obviously they often use the language themselves of human rights advocacy. They often say, the English Defence League, right back in 2009, said it was a human rights organisation. And so for some people, they say, well, if it's using the language of human rights and it's talking about, often they couch what they're doing in freedom of expression and things like that, people say, well, that can't be extreme. Well, I would fundamentally disagree with that, because what I think the English Defence League in terms of its discourse and its collective statements is saying is that they only want freedom of speech and they only respect these democratic liberal values for certain groups of the community. For those people who they deem to be others or dangerous enemies, they go to people's towns and cities and they make people feel very unsafe. And I've seen them, heard them screaming abuse at people. And so for me, collectively, it becomes an extremist organisation. Right. Okay. Not everybody necessarily on an individual level is there because they want to be an extremist, because they want to provide this kind of this opposition to basic fundamental values. But when you take it together as an organisation, I think it strays into that idea of extremism. Yeah.
So would you say there's a because you're talking about antagonisms and all of these different elements, and I think that I always think that that you spoke about grievances earlier. I know that with Islamist extremism, there's been a reluctance on the government to kind of say that grievances are valid. So they would say, well, grievances is not what motivates people towards doing these things, and there's something much more deep in them. How would you kind of position the element of violence? Do you think that you can be a non-violent extremist, or do you always think that an extremist, is either violent or has the propensity to violence for violence?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think for me, it's often comforting as a society to say that somebody's an extremist because of individual psychological factors. Because then as a society, we don't have to take any responsibility for it. We almost depoliticize it. It's just somebody being, mad or bad, basically, in that sense. And I'm often uncomfortable with that. I think that once you get to a position, so for me, hopefully what's come through in what I was saying a few minutes ago is at the heart of extremism for me is this idea of antagonism. And there's a political theorist called Chantal Mouffe who talks about the difference between agonism and antagonism. Agonism is where we disagree, and we'll always disagree on political issues because we have different values and different objectives. But under a system of agonism, we disagree, but I will respect your right to disagree with me, and I'll respect your right to exist. Under antagonism, when we get to antagonistic politics, I don't even recognise your right to disagree with me. I don't even recognise your right to exist. I see your very existence, your identity, as a threat to myself and my identity.
Yeah.
And for me, that idea of antagonism is at the core of extremism.
Really good
Once we go down that line of saying this group of people, okay, who we class as an other, and who we are in an antagonistic relationship with, and who we can't even agree that they should even have a right to speak or to hold a different identity to ours. Once you go down that road, and once that discourse starts to take hold, it becomes a lot easier to commit violence and commit acts of violence. It becomes a lot easier to go on a demonstration and shout abuse at people, or to throw bricks or throw bottles. So for me, the basis of extremism is this idea of a move to antagonism, and again, that idea of a cult of victims, where victimhood becomes, a more powerful identity than heroism in some ways. It increases that idea of antagonism, because we're victims. We have a right to attack or defend ourselves from our perpetrators. And so for me, this idea of antagonism is key and at the heart of extremism. And it does lead, in not every case, but if this is a discourse that people are buying into, and this is how people are seeing the world through this very antagonistic lens of friend and enemy, it can lead to violence.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting way of looking at it, because I've always struggled with the kind of the violence, the violence or non-violence thing. So I'm gonna be a bit cheeky on this one now. So I know you've written on Extinction Rebellion before, and I know they're not a far-right organisation. They're within the environmental movement. Would you say that Extinction Rebellion is an extremist organisation?
I think they are tending towards that position. I think they've moved from contentious to extreme. And again, and it won't be popular amongst a lot of sort of the more left-leaning academics, because again, we tend to have normative views. We don't like one group. We don't like the far right. We tend to have more sympathy. Certainly, I do with groups on the left. But if you look at what they do, and that kind of antagonistic language, that if people disagree with them, they're seen as, but won't even be engaged with. And so I see them, again, I don't think they're as far on the scale as some like the English Defence League, because I don't think to target minority groups. It tends to be about trying to target power or institutions with power. However, I think they are moving on that spectrum from contentious to extreme. It's an antagonistic discourse.
Yeah, see, it's funny because I agree with you. Yeah, I've always thought Extinction Rebellion is, if their ideology wasn't environmental issues, there would be no doubt that they are an extremist organisation. Having said that, I had an interesting conversation with a prevent lead. I won't say who, because I don't want you to be able to narrow it down. But I had a conversation with a prevent lead who said to me, when I said to him, I said, "Oh, Extinction Rebellion, they're like extremist organisation, right?" And he was like, "No." He was like, "No, because they're raising important issues." And I just thought to myself about the subjectivity of extremism, because for him, clearly he sympathised with, Extinction Rebellion. So it was like, oh no, they can't be extremists, So irrespective of the fact that their behaviours, their kind of activities, their kind of, are very extreme, like closing down a city, closing down a public transport network, these kind of things, very extreme behaviours, and their interpretation of, what is needed to be done in terms of the environment is also, sits outside the mainstream, in terms of that. And that point you was making about antagonisms, I would say that they are antagonistic towards those who don't buy into, a similar environment or kind of kind of understanding or interpretation.
And it leads to violence. I mean, you saw that guy on the tube train, and it became violence. So antagonism can lead to violence.
Yeah, and it did make me think, and you made that point. If this was a group that was targeting ethnic minorities, and rightly so, this would be seen as a group that's extreme. But because it does kind of sit with a lot of the views of let's be honest, white middle class people, white middle class liberals. This is something where, the perception is that, in many ways, because you empathise with something, you become, like you don't necessarily see the extremities of it. And I guess that I wonder whether that you could kind of put back to some of your stuff, when you were saying about, some of the people you went on demonstrations with, who went initially because of their grievances, their experiences, they're coming from backgrounds where, they were living in deprived areas and so on. Is it that shaped their view? They could maybe be more tolerant of what the EDL was saying in other respects, about other groups, because of the fact that their subjectivities were kind of like making them think differently about their own kind of grievances, or they were shaping it. So yeah, so sorry, I knew that was going to throw you off, but it was, when you were talking, I was thinking about
it's good to keep poking.
Yeah. So I realised that I've kind of like asked you to do a load so far. I just wonder whether, because one of the things that the students have got, they've got a resource which is available to them that looks at the Football Lads Alliance and the Democratic Football Lads Alliance, and this kind of explores the way in which, in some ways they kind of have a lot in common with the English Defence League and so on. But I wondered whether you could kind of respond to two questions as a kind of sum it up. Where do you think right-wing extremism is going to go next? And do you think things are going to get better or worse?
Okay, great. So I think we look at, I know me and you have had lots and lots of conversations about this before, when for me, and I'm possibly biased because I spent so much time studying English Defence League. For me, the fact the English Defence League is effectively collapsed. Tommy Robinson's moved on. The English Defence League is fragmented, and as a force, it's largely spent. And I think, like a lot of people, I was, happy about that. However, the discourse lives on. The discourse of victimhood, the discourse of using this idea of cultural racism, of protecting English culture from these enemies, the antagonism. It lives on in groups like the DFLA, and it also lives on in what I call key influencers or key individuals. Tommy Robinson. He's gone quite quiet at the moment, but he usually bursts back onto the scene, when you least expect him. Unfortunately, he still has an awful lot of followers, and you see this with a lot of the key personnel. You look at some of the key personnel of the English Defence League; they have moved into other organisations. Yeah. So the discourse, the personnel remain. This idea of victimhood remains. So, from a discourse theories perspective, which I'm interested in, this idea of identity, those identities remain, and they, people can and I think will continue to engage. Yeah. In terms of a wider sort of picture.
Just on that, again, can I just jump in and ask you your thoughts on another thing that you were just talking about now? So a few years back, I thought that Britain First was dead in the water. So Britain First, another organisation, links with the English Defence League, but they seem to be suddenly resurgent. This stuff around kind of asylum seekers, refugees, standing on beaches on the south coast with their telescopes, trying to stop dinghies arriving with, like swarms or one person on, as the reality is. But also this kind of stuff they've been doing through the pandemic with invading hotels where kind of asylum seekers and refugees are being housed. Did you see Britain First being resurgent again, or do you see them kind of taking on the mantle from the EDL?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is certainly more of a fragmentation. So there's smaller groups and groupie skills and things like that. But absolutely, these organisations will ebb and flow based on the wider context and the wider societal issues. Just like we saw the English Defence League had a little bit of a resurgence back in 2013 with the murder of Lee Rigby. Yeah. A soldier was murdered in Woolwich. When we have, when you have a media discourse that's saying that, using words like swamped and things like that, and this constant agenda setting about be scared of refugees, be afraid of refugees, then these movements will reactivate. And again, there's this ready-made discourse for them to operate within now. This idea that we are culturally under threat, we are victims. Often, also, I've found, especially work I'm doing at the moment, looking at a lot of their online transmissions, they often also tend to have very strong links with what I call conspiracy theories. And so we've seen this in America, but also in Britain. And there's literature suggests for these, conspiracy theories play a really important role within extremism. They delegitimize the voice of dissent. If you disagree with these groups, you become, you become part of the conspiracy. Yeah. And so again, as long as, and this is very much, you see how Tommy Robinson works as an individual influencer, very much sort of on what I'd call a conspiracy theory level. So there's still this really, really powerful discourse, of victimhood, of an English culture that's under threat, of a conspiracy by the establishment to destroy English working class and English identity. And so whilst they will come in slightly different forms, maybe more, sometimes more contentious politics in terms of boots on the ground, other times more online, the discourse still survives. And for me, this is a problem as our politics as a whole becomes more polarized. You see, anyway, I've spoken before about this, that, after Brexit, people, there's potentially rising hate crime and things like that. As our politics becomes more polarized, then all I see is antagonism becoming the dominant dividing line, of a dominant kind of antagonistic discourse as a dominant way of people understanding politics. And so, we see more and more people, I would argue, engaging in one form or another with these different groups and movements. That might be pessimistic, but for me, you see that.
I mean, it comes from, and the great thing about you is, it comes from an informed point of view, and that's the thing that that's why I really wanted you to have this opportunity for our students to talk to you and to listen to you, really, because everything that you've done, right from that start, you were embedded in, the EDL, you're very contemplative, you think about stuff, everything that you say comes from a very clear, and concise place, and like I say, like your understanding of what's going on and the kind of trends, and like I say, we speak about this quite a bit, and that's why I really wanted you to kind of have this opportunity today, to kind of speak to students. So I really appreciate that, and I think it's been fantastic, I'll be honest, I could have extended this for another 2 hours, I'm not sure how many students would have still been there, but I'd have been enjoying it right at the end, right?
There's only so much you can listen to our Wolverhampton accent for.
Oh, as a Londoner, I love the Wolverhampton accent, So just to wrap up, so Alex, so thanks so much for that. Really appreciate that. For those of you that are listening, do check out Alex's article. It's on the reading list. It's on Blackboard. It's there for you to read. Do have a look, because it does give you so many additional insights. What Alex has been able to give you today is just a very, the tip of the iceberg, a very thin slice, and that's the format that we're working in at this moment in time. If you do want to find out more, about Alex's work or about some of the stuff we're talking about, then, do reach out as well. I can put you in touch with Alex as well. If you want the stuff around Extinction Rebellion, which, which I kind of threw on Alex, I can send you that link to that as well. I can send that round. And this is some of the issues that we're picking up here. Let's talk about that in the workshops as well that follows. We have the 3 workshops at the end of the week. Let's pick up some of this. If there's stuff that you want to kind of explore a little bit more, and obviously I can't, provide the same depth as Alex can, but like if there's stuff you want to pick up, we can talk about that then. So just on behalf of our third-year students, Alex, may I say thank you again. Thank you to everyone from, the School of Criminology here at Leicester, the Centre for Hate Studies, and just, fantastic. Keep doing the research you're doing. Absolutely superb, and I'm still your #1 fan. So,
thanks, Chris, and good luck to all the students on your module. So thank you. It's been great chatting with you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Bye.